Cecil. Indeed, good morning. May I call Minister Morgan, please?
If I could hold that in your right hand, please, and to read the oath for me.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be nothing but the truth.
Your name.
My name is Elyned Morgan.
Thank you. And thank you for attending today and assisting the inquiry. And while you give your evidence today, if you could keep your voice up, if I ask you to pause or slow down, it's because there is a stenographer who is undertaking the note for the inquiry. And also your voice needs to be clearly received by the microphone because there is a recording. If I ask you anything that is not clear, please just ask me to repeat it or rephrase it, and of course I will do so. If I could just ask for your witness statement, please, to be pulled up on the screen for one moment, ends 371645. You signed this statement on the 14th of December of last year. Is it true to the best of your knowledge and recollection?
It is.
Thank you. I will touch today on a number of topics, but you will also be aware that the inquiry has your written statement and indeed the other documents and exhibits that you provided to the inquiry, and that will form part of the evidence in due course. If I may begin, firstly, by touching upon your professional background and indeed the roles that you played in the pandemic. First of all, if I may, in terms of the background, from November 2017 to December 2018, you served as Minister for Welsh Language and Lifelong Learning. Is that right?
That's right.
From 2018 to October 2020, you were the Minister for International Relations and the Welsh Language. And then from October 2020 to May 2021, you were the Minister for Mental Health, Wellbeing and the Welsh Language. And you will appreciate that it is your roles in the more recent, those last two ministerial roles that we are interested in today. Thank you. If I can begin, therefore, by looking at the January to October of 2020 period, that was when you were the Minister for International Relations and the Welsh Language. I understand that you wish to say a few words in relation to your ministerial responsibilities with regard to the Welsh language in Welsh. Would you like to do so now, Minister?
Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you. Okay, can you receive me? Yes, hearing? Good. Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to provide evidence for this. I know that many people are anxious to get replies to questions as a result of what all we went through as a country as a result of COVID. As you heard, I changed my role during the pandemic on several occasions. In the first place, I was responsible for international affairs and the Welsh language. Obviously, much of that portfolio closed down during the pandemic, and I spent a lot of that time at the beginning of the pandemic helping my deputy, who was responsible for culture, tourism, and, of course, there was nobody to take responsibility for hospitality, so I stepped into that role. I spent a lot of my time on that. As you outlined, I spent time then from October as a Minister for Mental Health and Welfare, and then in May, I took over as Minister for Health and Social Services. I think it's fair also to say I'm still in that role. I don't think many people who were in that role as Health Minister who's still in role today. And to me, the pandemic isn't over. We hope that over the next few days to give the 10 million of vaccinations, there are still waves of COVID affecting us in the NHS. A few weeks ago, with the latest data, there were 10 deaths as a result of COVID that's in a context of about 700 people per week who have died. We're dealing with long COVID. So there are lots of things where we're still dealing with COVID. And that's part of my responsibility to date.
What I wish to do is to take you back, if I may, to the beginning of the pandemic and your role in Welsh governmental decision-making. You were a member of Welsh Cabinet. That's correct, isn't it?
It is.
And we've heard evidence already from Vaughan Geffin that decisions taken by Cabinet were collective decisions.
They were.
Indeed. In addition to attending those Cabinet meetings, you also attended daily ministerial calls. Those were the ones that were first instigated in early April until June of 2020. You were engaged in the group known as the Star Chamber, and indeed we're going to be hearing more about that from Rebecca Evans, the Minister for Finance, later this morning. And then also the weekly core Covid-19 group that we've also heard a little bit of evidence in relation to. Upon taking up your role as Minister for Health and Social Services in May of 2021, you then began to attend the weekly meetings of the COVID update group. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that was with the First Minister, the Chief Medical Officer for Wales, Dr Atherton, and Andrew Goodall.
That's correct.
And we will touch upon those as we move through. But first of all, if I may, as I say, take you back to that beginning period in January to March of 2020. So the period leading up to the first national lockdown. With regard to your awareness of COVID-19 and the first case of COVID-19 within the UK, am I right that came to your attention around the 29th of January?
So the first case of COVID in the UK, yes.
Indeed. And then when it came to Wales, the first case was approximately a month later, the 28th of February.
That's correct.
Although you were not responsible or indeed involved, as I understand it, in the Welsh Government's preparedness plans, did you believe at that point, at the end of February, that it would be possible to trace and control those isolated cases, essentially containment?
Well, I think there was, I think at the time there was an effort to do that. Whether we'd have been successful, I'm not sure, but at the time there was an effort to contain it. But at that point, we didn't have any cases in Wales until the 28th of February.
Indeed. Now, following on from the 28th of February, you've also described in your witness statement how, for you, St David's Day, the 1st of March, was a key and critical time because of your role as Minister for International Relations and the Welsh language. Now, so we've had the first case in Wales on the 28th of February. You then make, during that period, or over that period, 2 international trips, is that right?
Well, one was took place before that first case. So I was out of the country from the 23rd of February. I think this was quite important in the sense that we'd just come out of Brexit. My chief responsibility was to make sure we had very close relationships internationally. St David's Day is a key time for us to go and beat the drum for Wales abroad. And so that was something that I carried out. So I missed the first cabinet meeting where COVID was discussed.
And in terms of the 23rd of February, did you consider at that point COVID to be a real threat to either the UK or more specifically Wales?
On the 23rd of February, I don't think I did at that point, no.
Indeed. And that's where you undertook the overseas trips to Canada and the United States. You then returned at the beginning of March, indeed, St David's Day as I understand it. And then you made a second trip to Ireland on the 11th of March. Now, this obviously post-dated that first case of COVID-19 in Wales. At that point, did you again see COVID-19 as being a significant threat to either the UK or Wales specifically?
I think even at that point, we hadn't realised quite how much of a threat it was. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office were not suggesting that people didn't travel abroad at that time. Again, this was a key relationship for me to go and make sure that we had very strong relationships with our Irish counterparts, our nearest neighbours, straight after Brexit.
And in terms of your state of knowledge with regard to COVID-19 around that period of time, so up until around the 11th of March, that week that followed, how well did you understand the threat to be, yourself personally?
I think I started to understand how serious the threat was on my return from Ireland. Clearly, that was the week when there was a lot of discussion about whether the rugby should go ahead. But on the 11th of March, we were still suggesting that the rugby was still supposed to be taking place a few days subsequent to that.
And do you consider that the Welsh Government was slow to recognise the serious public health threat that COVID presented at that point?
I think if we had our time again, we recognise that we probably should have been making earlier preparations.
And turning, if I may, to the lockdown itself, you explain within your witness statement, it's at paragraph 65, if that assists, page 16, that COVID was widespread in Wales by the middle of March of 2020. And you note that had there not been a lockdown at that point, the impact would have been on hospitals and public services would have been overwhelming, and many people would have died. Just dealing with the timing of that lockdown, firstly, do you consider that lockdown ought to have been earlier than when it was instituted, and could Wales have done that in advance of the UK government's decision?
Well, at the time, it was very late when we realised that the Welsh Government would have responsibility effectively for being able for managing how we responded to the pandemic. I think there was an assumption that it would have come under civil contingencies. I think also there has to be an awareness that in Wales, lots of people get their information from the UK press, and for us to have initiated something prior to England would have been very difficult, I think. In retrospect, I think there's an agreement across the United Kingdom that, given our time again, we would have gone into lockdown slightly earlier.
Thank you. And just dealing with the assumption that you refer to in relation to the Civil Contingencies Act, were there any attempts by you or the Welsh Government to ascertain how the pandemic would be dealt with in terms of a lockdown or the use of MPIs, and whether it would indeed be through the Civil Contingencies Act or Wales utilising its own devolved powers?
Well, I think that was very much more in the space of the Health Minister's responsibility at the time, so that was not something that I became involved with.
When you say, given your time again, could have locked down slightly earlier, do you want to give any timing on it? Some people have talked about a week earlier, some 2 weeks earlier. Are you talking about days earlier?
I think it's very difficult without the data. Obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, I think in all cases there were we would have done something perhaps a week earlier.
Thank you.
Moving through March, if I can bring up, please, a WhatsApp message that you sent in the Welsh Ministerial WhatsApp group. And what you have to say there is in relation to the position in Wales, and you've explained that COVID-19 was fairly widespread at this stage. We see that the message is dated on the 21st of March. And you're sending a message saying, we really need to stop people from coming to Wales on holidays. 2 busloads of pensioners arrived in St David's on Friday. Firstly, obviously, you are expressing some level of concern in relation to presumably tourists visiting. Mm-hmm. Is that right? The following day, on the 22nd of March, You sent a further message, this time to the First Minister, reading Mark, and it's the INQ 376650, reading Mark, Tenby is full of visitors. The Daily Mail is recommending the Welsh wilderness as a place to escape. I've been asking for a statement on this since Thursday. Please can we discourage people from coming? You explain the Health Board is extremely concerned about that. We then see the reply, which explains we are meeting later today to receive reports from local authorities and health boards and to get legal advice on powers available to us to act. It explains we are discouraging people from travelling as we have been since the start. We will issue advice to caravan park owners as fast as possible. Thereafter, our ability to do more than advise and discourage depends entirely upon our legal powers to do so. It continues, I'm afraid that it's cut off on this one, but it continues just so that we have the complete picture to say, we will know more about that by the end of the day. I will be talking to Nicola Sturgeon about the approach they are taking in Scotland. Thanks. Mark, I've got two questions, if I may, that arise, or two issues that arise from that. The first relates to the response by the First Minister. To place this in context for you, on the 20th of March, the First Minister had used devolved powers to close restaurants, bars and cinemas. But what we see here is a further reference to getting legal advice on the powers available to act. At this point, is it the position that the Welsh Government were not clear whether they had the legal power to prevent people travelling into Wales?
Well, that's certainly what the text suggests. I think it's probably worth emphasising on the 16th of March, there had already been a requirement for people to not undertake unnecessary travel. And what was clear is that people were not adhering to that. I think I was super sensitive to this because I live in St David's in Pembrokeshire, where there's a huge number of visitors, and they were still streaming in at that point, which is why it was something that I was particularly keen to look at. But yes, in relation to the legal powers, the text from the First Minister suggests that we were still looking for our ability to enforce it. It's not just about being able to make a statement, it's about our ability to make sure that people actually follow through on what we've asked them to do.
So firstly, it's unclear what legal powers were available to stop it, and secondly, what legal powers were therefore available to enforce it. And so at that point, the Welsh Government were not clear as to either set of those powers. That's a summary of what you've just explained?
That seems to be the suggestion from the text.
And the second matter that really arises from that is that you are making it plain that you've been calling for a statement to be put out to try to stop people coming, and that statement you've been requesting since at least Thursday, the 19th of March, a few days prior. Firstly, in relation to that, do you think that firstly getting that message out even on the 19th of March was too late?
Well, there had already been a requirement for people to not undertake unnecessary travel from the 16th of March. So this was reinforcing a statement that had already been made.
But just dealing with that, secondly, did you have concerns that your concerns were not being acted upon? In short, that you'd requested a statement and yet that still had not been undertaken, given everything you were seeing about people and the flooding even into the area that you lived?
I was really aware that by this time the Welsh Government was in full swing in terms of trying to mitigate against some of the worst effects that may be coming our way. And so I think they were firing on all cylinders. This might have been one of those areas where work had already, the announcement had been made. It was reinforcing an announcement that I was looking for.
But obviously it's a message that you are sending saying, I have been asking for a statement on this since Thursday. It was something that you considered to be of fairly significant importance. do you consider the First Minister was taking it as seriously as you were at that point?
I think the First Minister was taking it seriously, but I think he had a huge number of other issues that he had to consider at the same time.
Thank you. I now want to ask you about international relations and communications that you had within your role as Minister for International Relations, again around this time. To place it in context, you attended the UK Governmental Ministerial International COVID response meetings. Those were chaired by the Foreign and Commonwealth Minister at the time. How regular were those meetings?
They weren't very regular. They were quite sporadic. We didn't have much warning in terms of paperwork. Quite often there wasn't even a very clear agenda. Did get a sense that they were just responding almost to some of the questions coming up. There's a lot of work initially in relation to repatriation of citizens who were stuck abroad. There was some general talk about vaccination and when that would be developed, whether it would be available to developing countries. I kept on asking for information from them to see if we could learn from other countries in terms of what they were doing and what lessons we could learn. That wasn't forthcoming. So I commissioned work from our own international offices for them to undertake some work to see what we could learn from what countries had done abroad, in particular later on when it came to reopening after the end of lockdown.
Thank you. And just picking up on what you've explained there, do you know why the information you requested was not forthcoming from the FCO at that point?
I don't know why it wasn't forthcoming, no.
Was it necessarily the right source? I'm wondering whether, would it have been the FCDO or would it have been scientists working in a different group? I'm just wondering whether it was the right...
It might have been that it was the only forum I had access to, so why wouldn't I ask a question within that forum?
I understand that. Yeah.
So I think it should have been up to the FCO then to go and ask the scientists. Our scientists also later on did some of that international work as well. But I guess right at the beginning of the pandemic, the international relations portfolio was clearly not an area, and it's a reserved area. So already, there are limitations on how much we can do within that portfolio. So I was looking for work. I was looking for ways to contribute to what I knew to be a very serious situation. I thought this may be a way that I could contribute through the networks that I had at my availability.
Indeed, you do mention also within your statement that you were not always cited on all available information at a UK level in relation to these meetings. You also refer to PPE procurement and distribution. Other evidence that the inquiry has heard indicates that DHSC, the Department of Health and Social Care, was fairly involved within that role instead of the FCDO. Was that something that you were aware of, or was there a lack of clarity over which departments were dealing with which issues?
I think there was an understanding that was being led from a different department. The opportunity was for the FCO and for us in our international offices to try and do some work within those nations to try and identify if we could get some protective equipment directly from them. If we found sources, then we suggested that they went via our life sciences hub, so that it was a very clear method for them for the Welsh Government to procure.
Just dealing then and picking back up on the advice that you commissioned, with regard to that, and firstly, was it effective? Was it productive? Did you receive useful information from overseas? And to follow up on that, so that you understand why I'm asking you the question, how did that information then inform Welsh Government decision making?
I think it was found to be useful. I distributed it to my colleagues across the cabinet so that they had it directly, but also I shared it with the Chief Medical Officer. I think one of the areas where it proved particularly useful was in relation to education and how we'd reopen in education settings and what we could learn from how other countries had fared in that area.
Thank you. And again, just picking up with regard to international approaches, the inquiry has heard from Dr. Roland Salmon in relation to advocating for an approach that more closely resembled the Swedish response to the pandemic. Is that a matter that at that point you considered, or at any point during the pandemic?
It wasn't a serious consideration by the Welsh Government. I can't remember us having a conversation around the Swedish model, and we don't have any offices in Sweden, so we wouldn't have had any evidence from there. But what I did do is to try and follow up with some of the areas where we have much closer relationships. So, for example, Brittany, had conversations with Brittany authorities about how they were planning to open up in relation to tourism. Catalonia, they were telling us about how they were using technology in relation to contact tracing, the Basque Country, New Zealand. So I was trying to do some bilaterals to learn also directly from people, my counterparts in those countries.
With regard to those bilaterals, those were with countries that Wales had an established relationship with. Is that right?
That's right.
And you've mentioned Brittany, Catalonia, the Basque countries, and there's a common link with language.
Yeah.
And overall, what learning did you take away from other countries' experiences in terms of the lockdown, easing of the lockdown measures that you've already touched upon, and education?
Well, I think there was some learning around things like ventilation, face coverings. There.
I'll just pause you there for one moment. Ventilation. Do you mean ventilation in buildings as opposed to medical treatment?
Ventilation in terms of buildings, yes. School buildings, yes.
So face coverings. And were there any other areas?
Those are the areas that really stood out to me as areas where I think it was fed into the education department.
If I may now turn to government decision making and the role of medical and scientific advice, please. A theme throughout your witness statement relates to the limitations available of the data and evidence available to you in the Welsh Government, and how that then impacted upon the decision making that you undertook. If I can bring up, please, paragraph 6, please, of your statement. It's at page 2. And you explain there, it's approximately halfway down, that the Welsh Government's leadership was deliberately cautious in its response. And that was in particular where there were recognised limitations in the scientific advice and data, particularly the case when it came to making decisions about easing lockdown restrictions, and that seemed to be a tone which was in keeping and chimed with the majority of people in Wales. You continue to explain that often decision-taking was made without always having as definitive or comprehensive an evidence base that in an ideal you would have liked. And so in relation to decision-making, when you say it was deliberately cautious, do you mean in retaining restrictions for longer?
Before every meeting, when we were discussing in the 21-day reviews, we were reminded by the First Minister of the limitations of the legal powers that we had. And one of those is that we should act proportionately. And so we were very aware of that. I think just in relation to being deliberately cautious, I think if the evidence wasn't as clear as we'd like, we would err on the side of caution. And I think we were aware that the scientists generally were just one step ahead of us on the information that we were being given.
Thank you. And just comparatively, the inquiry has heard evidence that the general pattern in relation to the easing of restrictions, which is what we're discussing, was that England and Northern Ireland would ease restrictions and they reopen the economy first, followed by Scotland and then Wales. Is that right?
That's my understanding. I don't think any of it was deliberate in terms of us comparing ourselves with others. We were trying to do what was right for Wales, and that cautious approach seemed to chime with the people of Wales as well.
Indeed. And that perhaps answers my next question to some extent, which is why you think it was that it followed that pattern generally. You've explained that you were taking, as far as you were concerned, in the Welsh Government, decisions that were right for Wales. But more generally, why do you think that followed that pattern, so that Wales would typically be the last one to reopen or ease those restrictions?
I don't think it was a deliberate decision to do it in comparison to any other countries. We were doing what was right for our nation. We were looking at the data, looking at the evidence, looking at the spread, looking at the ability of the NHS to cope. So those were the things that were determining our decision making. And it wasn't just about that. We were also trying to make sure that we had a balanced approach. We knew that lockdown was affecting people emotionally, economically, physically, and so we had to balance the public health requirements with all of those other requirements.
And with regard to the cabinet decision making, a large number of those papers clearly demonstrate that data, scientific data, and modelling formed a substantial part of those discussions, and indeed was given considerable weight when it came to making the decisions in relation to the MPIs and relaxation. Picking up on the point of balance, do you consider that other harms, such as the ones you've just identified, from non-COVID related illness, another one, and socioeconomic and other societal harms, were also afforded equal weight or given proper consideration when making those decisions about MPIs?
I think we did try and make those decisions in the round, but I think there was also an understanding that if you didn't bring COVID under control, then it would have an impact on the economy. So we thought that the link was very strong of one with another. So I think in terms of the balance, we were very aware that the public health requirements was something that we should consider on balance, probably very seriously compared to some of the other areas that we were also concerned about, like the emotional well-being, the economic well-being of the nation.
You were clearly receiving a significant amount of scientific advice and data sets. Do you consider that you were equally served with respect to inputs in relation to those other societal harms? Were you receiving similar advice?
I think we were. I mean, just if you look at the scientific advice, we had the technical advisory cell were giving us very comprehensive information, perhaps 20 pages before every 21-day reviews. We had the CAS information. We had the information, a statement from the Chief Medical Officer prior to every 21-day review. We had the SAIL database, which was giving us that modelling that tried to project what would happen in future. The NHS also told us what the situation was. But then on top of that, we did have feedback in terms of the impact assessments. We had equality impact assessments. We had extensive conversations with our social partners and with economic partners as well. So it wasn't just one aspect that we were looking at. We had evidence from all of those. And one of the things that we did very carefully and very seriously was to have really comprehensive discussions with our stakeholders before we implemented any changes. So, they made it very clear to us, particularly in my dealings, for example, in relation to opening hospitality, how difficult it was for them, and how practically we could open whilst protecting people and trying to mitigate the possibilities for the virus to spread.
Thank you. I want to move now, if I may, to the use of wastewater sampling. Wastewater sampling having been used throughout the pandemic in Wales as one of the primary surveillance methods in relation to tracking the virus. Is that right?
That's right.
Again, that was a scheme that was led by Bangor University, it had Welsh Government funding, included Cardiff University, Public Health Wales and Welsh Water. Can you just briefly explain how wastewater sampling was used by the Welsh Government in its decision-making in relation to MPIs?
So there are about 48 places where samples were taken from wastewater, and that gave us insight into about 80% of the population of Wales, so we got a really good coverage. And the real benefit of this is that it didn't depend on how much testing was happening within the communities. What was interesting initially, because it was quite a new science, was actually comparing it with the ONS data, and it did seem to track the ONS data, but the difference was that actually this was very much real time, but also gave us an insight into what kind of variants were circulating in Wales. So we had early sight of when Omicron had hit, but it wasn't just about Omicron. We can see lots of other things within that wastewater. It was helpful, I think, more than anything, in giving us the confidence of when we could relax some of the some of the restrictions, because we could note where across the whole of Wales the virus was at its peak. So we knew it was coming down, so we could relax with a bit more confidence.
So you could monitor the decrease effectively through the wastewater sampling.
Exactly.
And with localised sampling also gave you some insight into the regional variations and indeed, as you say, the various different variants.
Absolutely. So, just to give you an example, later on, when the Omicron variant hit, there was a huge peak in terms of the number of cases, but it came down very, very quickly, which meant that we were able to relax some of the conditions around during that time, because we were confident, because we had the readings from the wastewater.
Indeed. And then plainly, it was something, a very useful tool and valuable tool in your view. It's the inquiry's understanding that the scheme was ended last August and so no longer continues. Is that correct?
So this was really difficult for us. We are massively challenged financially in relation to the two NHS budgets, and we've had to make some really, really difficult decisions. This is not a cheap way of monitoring, so I think we'd spent about £5 million on it. So with real reluctance, we did switch that off. But then, actually, we were concerned at the beginning of December that there may be a new variant, and I was really concerned that we didn't have the kind of monitoring. So we've actually switched it back on now, but obviously not with quite the same ability to monitor as we did before, because we haven't put as much investment into it. But I just think it's worth remembering that even the tools that we have that we found really useful have to be balanced against the day-to-day activity that we have to provide to the public of Wales in terms of serving them in the NHS.
So at the moment it is currently operating to a more limited degree. It is, exactly right. So following on from that, is it ready and available, therefore, to be stood up in the event of a future pandemic?
We could do that, but obviously there's a danger, because you need to make sure that you've got the scientists, and once you lose the scientists, then obviously that's more difficult to switch on. But there is now a clear skeleton system that we can build up.
Okay, in potential standing capacity? That's
right.
Just if I may now turn to the Welsh language, and I appreciate again, Chair, this is a position whereby we may switch to the Welsh language. So could I ask that everybody utilises their headphones who needs to? Just in relation, please, to the impact upon the Welsh language, the Culture, Welsh Language and Communications Committee considered the impact of Covid-19 on those speaking the Welsh language. It's a report that was published in December of 2020, and that can be found at INQ 66501. But in short, the report made 6 recommendations. The need to reinstate budgets for support and promoting the Welsh language because of reallocation during the response, the need to promote the Welsh language in the post-pandemic economic recovery plan, and the need to update the digital Welsh language strategy. Just focusing on those 3 for a moment, have those recommendations been implemented?
Sorry,
I'll just change to Welsh. I will answer in Welsh. Is that okay?
Answer this in Welsh.
Obviously, the money has gone back to the budget. Certainly in terms of technology, we are very aware that working with technology has become an exceptionally important part of all our lives. And it's incredibly important to understand how that can help us with the language. And one of the elements that became apparent within the COVID was millions of people were starting learning the Welsh language online, which was something quite novel, really. And those recommendations have been taken seriously.
Can
I also say, on a more general point, relating to the Welsh language, about 440,000 people speak Welsh. 440,000, sorry. So 17% of the population. So we've got we're very keen to get 1 million speakers by 2050, and one of our concerns.
I was going to go on to say how COVID had impacted the Welsh language, but that's fine.
And indeed, you set out, in any event within your witness statement, the impact of it. But more broadly, the report sets it out in some detail, including those recommendations. And my focus was, as a consequence, predominantly on those recommendations to see what had actually been undertaken. If I may then move to the period of October 2020 to May of 2021, on the 9th of October, you were appointed to a newly created ministerial position, and that was for mental health, wellbeing and the Welsh language. That was, as I understand it, specifically created to allow Vaughan Geffin, in his role as Minister for Health and Social Services, to focus on pandemic issues, NHS delivery and performance. Was the ministerial post created directly as a result of the pandemic and concerns in relation to mental health and wellbeing, or was it a post that had already been considered prior to the pandemic?
That's a question that you'll have to make to the First Minister, who has responsibility for organising how portfolios are determined.
Thank you. And given that it was a newly created post with regard to mental health, do you consider, looking back over the period that in the run-up to October 2020, so January 2020 to October of 2020, that mental health may not have been given enough focus by the Welsh Government over that period?
No, I don't accept that. I think that I know that mental health was always considered an essential service. We take mental health very seriously in Wales. We have a ring-fenced allocation for it. But there were concerns that fewer people were being directed to mental health services. We saw that there were more self-referrals. And we were very aware that there were people who were struggling. There were people who were dealing with bereavement. There were people who were dealing with financial challenges, and all of these things were having an impact on people's mental health. We're particularly concerned about young people, and a survey was carried out, I think, in late October, which suggested that 50% of the people of Wales were concerned about their mental health, and that when it came to young people, 3/4 of people between the age of 18 and 25 were concerned about their mental health. So it was an issue that we wanted to take very seriously. We, just before I was appointed, there was a refresh of the Together for Mental Health strategy, which deliberately targeted some additional resources towards supporting people with mental health, particularly telling people about the Call Mental Health helpline, making sure that we gave more resources to the Tier 0 and Tier 1, which is the kind of third sector support that can be given, making sure that we had cognitive behavioural therapy online, and also reaching out to those communities that perhaps had not reached out for mental health support, including, for example, people from the Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. Schools were also really important to us, so we increased the funding available for mental health in schools. So there were a huge number of areas where we were concerned, and also we were concerned about the mental health of people on the front line in our health and care services. So we put we put £1 million into support for them, and also for school teachers.
You mentioned the mental health of those suffering from bereavement. Was there any specific bereavement support?
There is a specific bereavement support available for people within Wales. If they contacted the Call Mental Health helpline, then they would have been directed.
During the pandemic?
Yes.
So basically, it wasn't specific to bereavement. It was, if you're suffering from bereavement, it's affecting your mental health, then you have to go to the mental health hotline.
Yes.
Was it advertised or flagged as being bereavement support, or was it simply mental health support?
I think it was more mental health support, and I made a point, if I ever did the briefings, to make sure that everybody had access to the number. So I did make a real effort to try and make sure that people had access to the number.
It's just that a lot of bereaved wouldn't consider that if they're going through grief, and the grief during the pandemic, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, was exacerbated by the circumstances. They wouldn't consider there were mental health issues, therefore may not think about contacting a mental health line. They had specific bereavement problems that needed support. Do you accept that?
I accept that, yes.
Now I want to turn, if I may, to later in the year in terms of the fire break. So I'm looking at the autumn period, in short, of 2020, and then the second lockdown. With regard, firstly, to the timing, do you consider that the fire break was timely, or ought that to have been instituted earlier?
I think we were still trying to work out whether the local restrictions were effective. There were parts of Wales where actually the virus wasn't very strong at the time, so we had to work out at what point the fire break should be instigated, because there were parts of Wales where the rates were very low. And at all times we had to act proportionately, so I think that was something for us to consider as well.
There's been evidence of scientific and medical advice from both the CMO and the CSA, so Dr. Atherton, Dr. Alford, that ultimately MPI's actions should have been taken sooner and for longer. And indeed, in relation to the local health protection areas, the First Minister has described those, such as in Llanelli, as a failed experiment. Do you agree with that?
Well, they clearly didn't work, which is why we needed to go into a fire break. So I think we were all learning at this point. They were still very much a tool that was being used in England. We had our first kind of local lockdown in Caerphilly on the 8th of September, and we were still starting to put some local authorities in at the start of October. So we were still putting them in October. So it's difficult to say. If we'd have gone earlier, we hadn't actually tested them out much prior to that event. And by the 15th of October, we had an agreement in principle to go into a fire break.
Now, in relation to looking at the rest of the UK and the MPIs that were being undertaken at that point, were you aware that in relation to the localised tier system that was in place across England, that the scientific advice was that those measures would simply not be enough? Were you aware of that?
I was aware of that on the 15th of October when we had the discussion in Cabinet. I don't think I was aware before that because I remember very clearly that I think we were told that Sir Patrick Vallance had suggested that that should be what we were doing. I don't think I'd heard it prior to that.
When you say that Sir Patrick Vallance has suggested that that was what you should have been doing, what measures are you referring to?
To the introduction of a fire break.
Fire break. And that was the first time that you were aware of that advice?
I think that was the first time I was aware of that advice.
Looking back now, do you consider that different decisions should have been taken throughout September and October of 2020?
At the time, I think us going into a fire break before England was quite a brave decision. We were still not sure whether the Welsh public would follow us. Going into a lockdown at the same time on 23rd of March, we went in together. We came out more slowly. Would they follow us going into winter, a difficult time, into another lockdown? And obviously we were really concerned about the financial ability of the firepower of the Welsh Government at the time to be able to sustain a lockdown for as long as was necessary. And I think the scientists were suggesting we should be doing it for 3 weeks. And I think we didn't have the economic power to maintain a 3-week fire break. And it was really disappointing that the UK government was not forthcoming in terms of financial support. And then 2 weeks later, when they wanted to go into a fire break, they suddenly announced a very different approach. And I think that was a very difficult time for us as a nation because I think people felt like we were second-class citizens in the context of the UK government. What was suitable for them was not suitable for us 2 weeks earlier, and I think that was a huge disappointment to us.
I think I need to point out there is another side to that debate. I have heard evidence that suggests the UK government weren't taking that approach, but I think I'll just put that on record at this stage.
Indeed. And of course, there is other evidence before the inquiry. May I also just touch upon some aspects within your witness statement, because you suggest in your witness statement that actually a big factor in limiting the fire break to 2 weeks as opposed to 3 was actually not financial, but was to balance the harms of not locking down against the harms of locking down effectively with one eye, for example, on people's mental health and other implications and repercussions. So with regard to that aspect, was that a primary factor as far as you were concerned in limiting it to 2 weeks as opposed to 3 weeks?
I think what was more important for me is that we were very clear that it would be a short period of time. So I was very concerned about people's mental health going into a cold, dark winter. So locking down then was very different from locking down going into spring. So for me, the most important factor was to manage expectations, whether that was around 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I think it was more the economic argument and concerns that led us to have the 2-week restriction rather than 3 weeks.
Then just dealing, if I may, with the timing of that decision, a fire break was agreed to in principle by Cabinet on the 15th of October. due to start and commence on the 23rd of October, but that in principle decision was not formally approved until the 19th of October. So effectively it took those 4 days to actually make that decision into a formal decision. And am I right that the delay there was because you say there was insufficient information to make a fully informed decision at that point, that you wanted further advice on risks of transmission from school children?
Yeah, so that was a consideration. We wanted to be clear whether there was a greater risk of having children in unregulated environments where they'd be mixing rather than a regulated environment in relation to being in schools. So we wanted further advice on that, and that advice was forthcoming. So I think the 15th of October was a Thursday. Clearly people must have worked very hard over the weekend to give us that advice, which was given to us on the following Monday.
But overall, given that advice had been received as early as mid-September, that a circuit breaker was needed and would be most effectively if implemented early and deeply, and I'm sure you've heard more broadly the evidence in relation to interventions being early, deeper, harder. Do you consider the delay in implementing a circuit breaker in Wales to be justified?
I do think that we can justify the circuit breaker in Wales.
The delay, not the circuit breaker, but the delay.
The delay.
Taking it from that initial advice in mid-September all the way through until the 23rd of October.
So one of the considerations was about the half-term holiday and whether that would help or hinder the spread of the virus. So that was the area that we wanted more advice on, which is why I think there was a greater delay.
And is your evidence, therefore, that the delay is justified by the need for further advice, as opposed to being in receipt of that scientific advice, as I say, in mid-September?
In retrospect, we probably should have gone a week earlier and should have gone for longer, but there were reasons why that wasn't the case.
Now, if I may turn to slightly later in the chronology and look at Omicron, and bring us back into summer of 2021 into winter of 2021. Can I ask for INQ 55222, please? This is in relation to the 14th of July of 2021. This is a few months after you became the Minister for Health and Social Services. There's a COVID-0 meeting about relaxing inbound border health measures for vaccinated travellers. And that same day we see you texting Ms Jenkins and saying, on COVID-0, we are all fucked. What prompted that text?
Well, can I first apologise for my fruity language? I don't think that's going to go down very well with my husband who's a priest, and being a vicar's daughter, that's probably not what you want to see. But this was quite early on after my appointment. So on this particular COVID-0, there were some very interesting discussions. There was a suggestion that we should be opening up our borders to travellers coming from France, and the introduction of a pilot programme where we would recognise vaccination certificates from France and allow travel to recommence. But on the same day, there was a discussion in a different COVID-0 about whether France should be put onto the red list. So I just found that a massive contradiction and very, very worrying. There was also the issue about whether we should allow visitors to come from the United States and whether we should recognise their vaccination certificates. I think they had a certificate called the CDC, and it was made very clear on COVID-0 that there was real opportunity for fraud in relation to the use of the CDC. So again, that was something that concerned me. And the third thing was that there was a very clear concern on that meeting that the border force services were not ready for the kind of ramp up, so there was no operational problem. So I think that was the context in which I was making that very fruity remark.
Thank you. I'm now going to go into winter, and that's when, of course, Omicron first emerged. We don't need to go to it, but the First Minister for Wales and the First Minister for Scotland wrote a joint letter to the Prime Minister on 29th of November in relation to the risks posed by Omicron. But on the 27th of November, which was also the date, incidentally, when the first variant of Omicron was identified in the UK, you sent a WhatsApp message to the Northern Irish Minister for Health, Robin Swan, if I can call that up, please, at INQ 331060, stating, "We are doomed." And then we see a response of a mix of that, "We're doomed," and "Don't panic." Do you recall what that was in relation to? Was that Omicron?
That was absolutely Omicron. So the first case we'd heard of had been identified in South Africa on 22nd of November. The first case in the United Kingdom was on the 27th of November. What we did know is that this was a variant that transmitted very quickly, and I was really concerned at this point that we would see some quite considerable peaks as a result of Omicron entering our country.
You've explained that you were very concerned. Was there at that point a fatalistic mindset within the Welsh Government that there was going to be a future wave and more restrictions were necessary rather than waiting to see what the evidence was or scientific advice was as it unfolded?
There was no fatalism at all. We got on to a very serious footing. We held, I think, 4 or 5 cabinet meetings within a week. First of all, we put 10 countries on the red list, which meant that they had to go into quarantine. They had to take tests on day 2 and day 8. We brought forward the booster campaign, and we agreed to look at the regulations on a weekly basis because we were so concerned about the changes. And you referred there to a request by the First Minister to ask for a COBRA meeting with the UK government that I don't think happened till later.
If it assists, the COBRA took place subsequently on the 10th of December.
Later, yeah.
And the letter was on the 29th of November. You refer in your statement to there being various information gaps at that point in relation to Omicron, including the efficacy of vaccinations, so whether the vaccine would work, and other matters, including the severity, essentially, of the variant. What decisions do you consider would have been made differently had there not been those information gaps there?
So we didn't know about the efficacy of the vaccine, and we didn't know how long the protection was in the people who were vaccinated. So waning, we were very worried about waning, in particular amongst the most vulnerable. So we, as I say, what we did is to bring forward the booster vaccination. Sorry, did I answer your question properly?
My question was, which decisions would you have made differently?
I don't think we would have made many differently. I think you can see from the evidence that I put forward that there was a very concentrated increase in terms of the drumbeat of tightening up the restrictions. So, for example, we made it a legal requirement for people to be able to work from home. We put more guidance in place around what kind of face coverings should be worn. We already had COVID passes that were necessary to go into cinemas and theatres and nightclubs. we encourage people to use lateral flow tests. So there were a whole series of things that we tightened up, ready for what we knew was going to be quite a challenging time.
If I may ask you, please, about nightclubs, one of the matters that you've just mentioned, and if I can take you to INQ 376661, you explain about tightening up various restrictions in the COVID passes. Nightclubs were forced to close from the 27th of December. Now, you'll appreciate that's probably one of their busiest times of year. It's the New Year period. Just want to deal with your text message here, please, if I may. You say, Mark, I'm concerned that if we keep nightclubs open, we lose our moral authority to ask people to limit contacts. I was hoping that the papers might have given that as an option. So was the decision in relation to nightclubs one based essentially on moral authority or perception, as opposed to dealing with the scientific advice or evidence in relation to the risks that were posed in such environments through use of the COVID passes, for example?
No, I mean, we'd had TAC advice previously in the previous July that set out some of the risks around nightclubs, that they were areas where there was a potential for greater spread of the disease because of loud music and singing. We like to sing in Wales, as you know. The closer interaction, the humidity, the lack of ventilation potentially. So there were all of these things that made them vectors for further transmission. So I always had a concern around these. We'd obviously introduced the vaccine certificate on the 11th of October, so those were already in place. But because we didn't know at the time whether the vaccines would be effective, then I was really concerned about what the impact might be if we allowed people to gather in great numbers.
But being clear about this, obviously that was advice in July. By this point, as you explained, you had the vaccination and COVID passes in place and in play. And your message very clearly speaks about moral authority and limiting of contacts as opposed to any risk. So I'm asking, was that the primary issue for you at that stage in relation to nightclubs?
No, I don't think it was all about moral authority, although I think that it was difficult to ask people to limit their contacts if you were still allowing people to gather in significant numbers. But there were difficulties around nightclubs. One of them was an issue around the definition, what is a nightclub, because you can have pubs where people can dance and whether that is a nightclub. We were really concerned also about the border issues. So in Cardiff, for example, you're very close to Bristol, so there was a possibility that people would cross the border. And there's also the issue of whether you would displace activity into unregulated house parties. So these are all things that we had to balance in terms of risks. It wasn't a one-way risk either.
Thank you. I now want to move to the topic of four nations engagement, if I may, and informal communications. In summary, you're complimentary within your witness statement of both health secretaries, Matt Hancock and Sajid Javid, in relation to your interactions with them and communications. Is that right? You found them to be productive, fruitful relationships?
I certainly did, yes.
You explain that you were a member of two WhatsApp groups with the various ministers, the first with Matt Hancock and the other four nations' health ministers, and then the second with Sajid Javid. You do not have either of those chats anymore. Why is that?
Those have been deleted, but I do understand that you have got copies of those from other people. So those are available to you, and you'll see from them that there's nothing in them that I would consider to be problematic.
No, my questions are really focused on the failure to retain potentially relevant information that goes to issues of
Sure.
governmental decision making.
Yeah.
And would you accept that failure is a shortcoming?
I think in terms of decision making, I can give you assurance that no decisions were made on WhatsApps, but obviously, I have provided the inquiry with reams of WhatsApp messages and hundreds of pages of notes. So, in terms of transparency, I think I've been almost as transparent as I can be. I'm sad that I don't have those, but as I say, you do have the evidence from other people, so you can see what I said.
Now, Matt Hancock resigned in June of 2021, was replaced by Sajid Javid as the Health Minister. On the 11th of December, you created a new group of health ministers with Sajid Javid, inviting him to join. You sent him a message saying, "We thought we should set up a new one without Matt Hancock on it." Does that mean that Matt Hancock was still within your communications with the
I don't think
that
so.
earlier group?
I don't think so. I think we probably no. I don't think I can't remember that we communicated a lot during that time. So the reason for setting one up was because we knew we were heading into difficult territory with Omicron.
Okay. Dealing then also with other methods and other of communication, and indeed record keeping, as you've explained, you provided various documents to the inquiry, including a notebook. I'd just like to ask you about two of those entries, if I may, please. It's INQ 327594, page 8, and on this page we see, on page 8 of the notebook, and we see two entries. Here we are. Is Matt Hancock hopeless? And then Prime Minister chaos. Doing the best that we can in relation to the dates and looking at the material around it, on the 16th of June of 2021, Dominic Cummings published various text messages between him and the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, in which Boris Johnson referred to Hancock as totally fucking hopeless. And in addition, he also criticised the Prime Minister, this is Dominic Cummings, for chronic dysfunction, number 10 lies, and so on and so forth. In relation to your question, is Matt Hancock hopeless? Firstly, is that a reference to that Cummings material?
I'm guessing it must have been. I can't remember, but I'm guessing it must have been, and it would make sense in terms of the timing. But I used these notebooks for all kinds of things, and a lot of it was about preparing to, for example, speak to my political colleagues. So clearly, they would be more political in nature. So it may have been that I was setting this out as something to say to my political group, just to remind me that those are the kind of things that were happening at the time.
There are similar entries that relate to what appears to be the 19th of July, Freedom Day, self-isolation and chaos at that point. But the one that I'm next interested in, please, is page 59. You make an entry under the heading Foreign Travel. It relates to the Covid-19 meeting. And what you say there is that generally, different page, I can read it to you, generally invited to meetings, have our own analysis, access to data, so can make own conclusions. On this occasion, we were not invited. Learnt of English moves via the media. Wholly unsatisfactory situation. Unapologetic, not being driven by public health. Why was it unsatisfactory that the Welsh Government, if they were learning of decisions through the media? Did you raise that with the Health Minister at the time?
I raised it in several COVID-19 meetings. We were being invited very late. We were being given information sometimes minutes before the meetings. And as clearly I've stated there, we weren't even invited to that particular meeting. I am aware that in one meeting I was very concerned that the thing that was driving decisions was actually the economy, and more than that, it was tourism in London. and the need to reinstate and to encourage more tourism in London. As I say, quite often on those meetings, I was actually a lone voice. So there were occasions when the devolved nations would be in the same position as me, but there were occasions where the public health concern was being expressed by Wales, and sometimes, to be fair, by the health minister, but they were quite often outspoken by the other representatives on the group, which represented the economy and transport and all kinds of other areas. And you know, that's allowed. It's just that it's clear that the majority would come out against the kind of public health position because of the makeup of the people on the committee.
I just want to now turn to the final topic, if I may, and it's a theme that we touched upon at the beginning of your evidence, and it relates to the understanding of regulations and the clarity of regulations. If I can call up INQ 316403. These are messages with Rebecca Evans in relation to what was and was not allowed. I'll make it clear it's not just her. There are other similar types of questions from other individuals such as Kirsty Williams, Leslie Griffiths, Lee Waters and so on. And these are just a handful of examples. But what we see on the 5th of July at 2020 at 11:45:48, for those looking at the screen, she asks, just checking that this remains correct, that people can go and stay in their own static caravans, etc. from the 6th of July, but can't rent them out until the 11th. Had a few queries as the guidance on the website isn't 100% clear. Thanks. You reply and you say, you can't go and stay in your own static caravan until the 11th. You can go and prepare it if the site manager allows, but you cannot stay. FAQ published this on Friday. So in short, you're correcting your colleagues' understanding. Is that a fair characterisation?
I think that shows that actually the answer was already public. So there was an invitation there to go and look at the information that was already in the public arena.
It does show that it was already public, but it also shows that individuals within government did not understand or were aware of the own regulations that the government was passing. Is that a fair comment?
We were going through really detailed questions, and there were lots and lots of different aspects to those questions, and if people needed clarity, I don't think there's a problem with making those situations more clear for people. I don't see a problem with
Give
that.
you another example, page 52, please. It's 183720. Ms Evans asks, since you're all here, can children leave the country for swimming lessons? And you reply shortly thereafter at 1850, so 650:01. People shouldn't be crossing county borders to do sport unless they are professionals, including children swimming, I'm afraid. The point here is, would you agree that members of the public who are being asked to follow these rules may be frustrated that the Welsh Government itself was on occasion confused by the rules, that there was not, in short, clarity over what was and was not allowed?
I think the clarity was probably there in the regulations, but quite often people wanted us to read the regulations for them. So the rules were clear. People needed to go and read the rules that were set out and the guidelines that were set out. And we spent a huge amount of time talking to stakeholders about those regulations. So I'm not sure if that's fair. I think the information was available.
Sadly, it's clearly a problem, though, if your own ministers and members of government do not simply go, to, as you say, to public information to find it, but need to speak to their colleagues. It's not a happy situation.
I think they were just trying to take shortcuts to gather information.
Chair, those are the questions that I have for you, Minister. There are some further questions.
I was hoping to finish you before the break, Baroness Morgan, because I know as serving Minister you'll have other duties. Can you bear if we take a short break now and then come back to finish you?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. I shall return at 25 to 12.
All right.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms Morgan. I represent the Covid-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru. I appreciate you were only in post in May 2021, but we understand you're a member of the Cabinet. So I just want to ask you if, as part of the Cabinet, you became aware of a letter that came in, a document that was published by the Commissioner for Older People, Helena Herklotz, in April 2020. So if we can have up INQ 30181739, please. And if you can just indicate, my screen's gone blank. Oh no, there it is. We know that this was published by Helena Herklotz on the 15th of April because she's explained to the inquiry she was so concerned about what was happening in care homes. And just to have a very quick look at it before I ask you whether or not you knew about it at the time, you can see there, can't you, that she's saying older people and families continue to raise significant concerns about the issues currently facing care homes. She's raising concerns around testing, availability of PPE, and if we just look down at the list, again, PPE and testing, amongst other things being raised. And if we just look at the last bullet point, she's also saying information is captured and published about levels of infection and deaths, so there is transparency and so that the data informs decisions including on resource allocation. And if you look slightly below that, she's asking on the Welsh Government to publish a specific action plan and citing just below that there are now suspected nearly a third of care homes in Wales have coronavirus. So my question to you is, as a member of Cabinet, did this document come to your attention at the time? And to assist, we can't see it was being discussed in Cabinet minutes. So do you remember whether it was brought up in Cabinet?
I can't recall that coming up in Cabinet. There were general discussions about care homes. I can't remember whether this particular statement came before us.
But do you agree that as a minister it should have been brought to your attention? And I know you obviously were not responsible at this point, but just generally in the Cabinet, do you think this sort of a document should be something that's raised in Cabinet, bearing in mind where it was coming from and the concerns that were being raised?
Well, we all have different ministerial responsibilities, and the Deputy Minister responsible would certainly have had sight of this, and I'm sure would have drawn the relevant people's attention to it. When I did step into the role as Health Minister, I have met with the Older People's Commissioners and have correspondence with her.
Okay. Now, the inquiry's seen that the response did come from Julie Morgan, the Deputy, and we're not going to look at that letter now, but essentially the response was that she was not convinced that an additional action plan above the existing arrangements would add value. And just to assist, this is what Helena Herklotz told the inquiry. She said, I thought that was inadequate, and that she was angered actually by the notion that working on an action plan, producing an action plan, bringing the work together would add no value at a time when people were dying in care homes, where families were distraught. I just thought the response was inadequate. So again, my question is this: was Cabinet cited on the response that was to go out to Helena Herklotz? Do you recall?
That wouldn't have been normal practice for us to see letters that go out in response from.
Or was it
ministers.
discussed?
I can't recall that it was discussed.
Okay. Second topic, please, is learning of lessons. Now, as I said earlier, it's understood that you came into post in May 2021 as Minister for Health and Social Services. Now, you will understand that the people in Wales who lost loved ones from COVID-19 are looking to this inquiry, and indeed members of the Welsh Government like yourself, for answers as to not just what went wrong, but also to see if the Welsh Government has reflected and considered what you could have done better. And of course, you'll understand the trauma of those who lost loved ones in care homes. I've just taken you to some of the very serious concerns being raised by Helena Herklotz. Now, no doubt when you came into your role in 2021, you will have reflected on these issues, and you will of course reflected on the critical findings of the Senedd Health and Social Care and Sports Committee reports into the Welsh Government's response to Covid-19 in care homes in Wales. Now, you rightly acknowledged a moment ago, when you gave evidence in Welsh, that many people are anxious to get replies to questions, and you very fairly say in your witness statement there is a need to provide answers to those who have lost loved ones. So bearing this in mind, can I ask you this, and it's whether you consider that the Welsh Government made any mistakes in how they dealt with care homes in 2020 in response to the Covid-19 pandemic, and whether there are lessons to be learnt. And just to be clear, this is not a question about hindsight, which of course we've heard a lot about in this inquiry. It's about whether you think mistakes were made in respect of the management of care homes on what was known by the Welsh Government at the time.
Well, I know that the Health Minister gave evidence yesterday around the issue of testing, and he was the one in the position to be able to make decisions in relation to that. What I can tell you is in relation to the time when I was Health Minister, I did try and learn some of the lessons. So, for example, when Omicron hit, one of the things we did was to tighten up guidelines around people who visited multiple sites, and that included care homes. So that was something that I know we tried to learn the lesson of.
But what lessons were learnt by the Welsh Government? I know you're in post in May 2021, but you must have had to reflect back, because we know the Senedd was undertaking inquiries. So you must have had to reflect back. Are you able to tell the bereaved in Wales, and indeed this inquiry, what lessons your department learnt about how this was managed in care homes in 2020?
So the example I've just given you is an example of the lessons learnt. So one of the things that we were concerned with is the potential for people who move from one care home to another to be carrying the virus, and that's why when Omicron hit, we tightened up the guidelines around the visiting of multiple sites.
What about testing, PPE, discharging of people into care homes with COVID symptoms in 2020? Were any lessons learnt about that, do you think?
Well, later on, a lot of that was put in place. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there may have been issues in relation to the testing opportunities. That wasn't true later on in the pandemic.
Thank you very much, my lady. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Heaven. A couple of questions from me, Baroness Morgan. You mentioned in your evidence, in answering questions from Ms Cecil, that you got what you called learning from your international relations, which was, you said you mentioned two things, ventilation and face coverings. What was the learning you got in relation to face coverings from international experience?
What we were looking for there was not was what other people were doing, rather than, and then I fed that to the appropriate department at the time. So it wasn't what I learnt; it was information that I then passed on, and it was up to them to determine that.
And were you getting the impression that international experience was the use of face coverings was a good idea?
I wasn't making any judgments on it. I was just passing on the information of what other people were doing.
I appreciate you weren't making the judgment, but did you get the impression that international experience was suggesting that people in foreign countries were saying that face coverings were a good idea?
In some instances, that was the case, particularly perhaps in educational establishments.
And you passed that on to your colleagues?
I did pass that on to my colleagues.
You talked about the cautious approach of the Welsh Government. It doesn't seem to have acted on that kind of experience when it came to face coverings.
We were following a lot of the advice given to us by the Chief Medical Officer.
Right. The only other question I have, and just to be fair to you, you said that you had deleted your WhatsApp messages. Why did you delete them?
I think, I didn't delete anything deliberately. I think I've handed over reams of...
I understand that. I just really, it's a simple question, to be fair to you, because, as you know, WhatsApp messages cause a lot of
Yeah.
interest in certain circles. So it's just really why and when did you delete them?
I think, I don't know quite why or when, but clearly there were only a couple of examples where that happened, and you do have the information from those.
Right, so you can't help on why or when.
I can't help on that, no.
Right, thank you
Apart
very
from
much.
what's in my evidence.
Right. Thank you very much for your help. You're now free to go. Diolch. Thank you. Yes, Ms Cecil.
Indeed, thank you. May I call Minister Rebecca Evans, please?
Thank you.
I should hold the Bible in your right hand, please, and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Keep this award there for you.
Thank you.
I hope we haven't kept you waiting for too
No.
long.
Good afternoon, Minister. If you could please give us your full name.
Yes, Rebecca Mary Evans.
Thank you for attending today and assisting the inquiry. While you give your evidence, if you could please keep your voice up and into the microphone. There is a recording being taken and indeed a note as well of your evidence today. If I ask you anything that is not clear or you need me to repeat anything, please just say.
I will. Thank you.
Minister, you provided a witness statement, INQ 346272, for the inquiry. It was signed on the 1st of November of 2023. I understand that there is one correction that needs to be made to that statement, and it's on paragraph 232 of the statement. And where it reads public sector in relation to contracts, it should read private.
That's
So
correct.
Replace public with private.
That's right. Thank you.
And with the exception of that, is it true? Is your statement true to the best of your knowledge and recollection?
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much. Minister, you were asked to provide a statement to this module in your capacity as Minister for Finance and TREFNIV, and latterly Minister for Finance and Local Government during the period that spanned January of 2020 to May of 2022. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Prior to your appointment as the Minister for Finance and TREFNIV, you held a number of portfolio roles and other ministerial roles. Is that correct?
Correct.
Having initially been first appointed to Welsh Government in June 2014.
Correct.
You've been in government for quite some time now.
Yes.
Thank you. You were appointed to the role of Minister for Finance and TREFNIV in December of 2018. That was when Mark Drakeford became First Minister.
Correct.
With regard to your responsibilities in that role, can you just give us a very short overview, firstly in relation to your ministerial role in relation to finance, and then secondly, I'll move on to your role with regard to TREFNIV.
Yes, so in relation to my role in finance, I'm in charge of the Welsh Treasury. I have responsibility for the strategic direction of the use of Welsh Government resources, budget monitoring and management, strategic investment, taxation policy, and also relationships with HMT and HMRC, to name just a few.
And for those who are following outside of Wales, can you assist us with what the TREFNIV is, please?
Yes, the TREFNIV is our Senedd equivalent to the Leader of the House. So I would represent the Welsh Government and the Labour Group on the Business Committee, and also respond to requests every Tuesday from colleagues in the Senedd asking for statements from the Government on a whole range of issues.
Indeed, that role was subsequently transferred away from you in May 2021, when you inherited instead the responsibilities for local government. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
But focusing, if I may then, on your role with regard to finance, did that broadly stay the same throughout that period, January 2020, through the elections in May of 2021 to mid-February 2022?
Yes, and to this day, in fact.
Indeed. Thank you. You will understand that it's in your role as Minister for Finance that I'm going to concentrate my questions on today. But of course, if your answers will be assisted by any other issues that fall within your portfolio, please feel free to mention those. But generally speaking, your financial portfolio during that period of January 2020 to May of 2022, which is of course the date range the inquiry is interested in, your portfolio was focused on managing the Welsh Government's financial response to the pandemic.
Yes, that's correct.
It's also right that you led on all intergovernmental finance-related discussions on behalf of Wales.
Yes.
And the main forum through which those discussions were held were the Finance Minister quadrilaterals, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Just touching on those meetings for a moment, the quadrilaterals, do you think those meetings took place frequently enough over the duration of the pandemic?
It was certainly an improvement in terms of what came before. When I came into post in December 2018, the Finance Quadrilateral hadn't met for a year, I understand, so that concerned me. So to my first meeting, I took a paper which essentially set out some proposed terms of reference for future working, which would have been much more frequent meeting, a relationship of parity, rotating chairs, shared secretariat and so on. And we did make progress on that. So over the course of the pandemic, the quadrilateral met much more frequently. So things improved in terms of the frequency of meetings, but the quality of meetings is always variable. I will say that things have continued to improve in terms of frequency and sometimes in terms of the quality of those meetings following the intergovernmental review work as well, which has really helped put that finance group on a more formal footing, which has become more useful over time. So things definitely improved over the course of the pandemic.
Indeed, and it's been formalised now, hasn't it, as a standing committee, the Finance Interministerial Standing Committee?
Correct, yes.
And how frequently, broadly speaking, were you meeting during the pandemic period?
Over the course of the pandemic, I think we would probably meet, I think we met around 6 times in the first 6 months, and then I think it was around 4 times in the next 6 months. So monthly, every 6 weeks, something like that.
And with regard to the formalisation into the standing committee, is that a structure that you consider would have assisted during the pandemic and will assist in the future?
Yes, definitely. I think the relations, certainly in terms of that structure, are definitely on a better footing for the next pandemic.
Thank you. The next topic that I wish to touch upon, please, with you are sources of funding. So looking at the financial situation set up between the UK government and the Welsh government and the fiscal framework. The fiscal framework was agreed in December 2016, and that establishes the financial powers of the Welsh government. Is that right?
That's right.
Just, if I may summarise, obviously in headline form, because these issues can get very complicated, but trying to take them as simply as possible. There are 4 primary sources of funding for the Welsh Government, is that right?
That's right.
And just breaking them down, we first have what's called the block grant, which are funds that are granted by the UK Government.
Yes.
The second are those funds that are raised internally within Wales by means of taxation or other charges. The third is borrowing capacity by the Welsh Government, and the fourth is European Union structural funds that become available.
Correct.
So perhaps if I can concentrate, if I may, on the block grant and the relationships between Wales and the UK. Just very briefly, what is the annual block grant?
So at the time of the pandemic, it was around £20 billion, but now that's increased to around £23 billion.
And just dealing with...
sorry, I should say the 23 includes the money that we raised through tax, so it would have been 18 billion in terms of block grant, and the rest would have been raised in tax, and around 20 now.
And just so that everyone understands what a block grant is in principle, that's a level of public expenditure that is decided by the UK government through the Treasury to be allocated to Wales each year. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. It's very much a function of how much the UK government decides is needed to be spent in England in particular. So the overall amount of money spent within the UK is definitely decided by the UK government, and the block grant really does give us a population share of that, but also with a needs-based formula attached to that as well. So for every £100 spent in England, we will have a population share of around 5.6, and then when you apply the needs-based element over that, it's around 5.8.
Thank you. And then in addition to that annual block grant, which, as you say, is a share effectively of the overall public expenditure within the UK, the Welsh Government also receives what's called the Barnett consequential funding element. And that can be both positive and negative. That's why I say it can get complicated. But put in very short form, what is Barnett consequential funding?
The block grant is the funding as you've described, and we would normally have that through a comprehensive spending review or a single year funding round. But then applied to that, we have changes that are made through the year, and they're formalised then at supplementary estimates, which happens right at the end of the year, usually around February time. And basically, if the UK government departments increase spending in areas which are devolved, then we will receive that share, population plus the needs-based. But also equally, if the UK government departments underspend or money is shifted away from those areas where we have devolved responsibility, then our budget will be reduced as well. So that does make it very difficult, even in a normal year, to manage the budget, especially when you only get clarity at the very end of the financial year.
Indeed. So positive funding, I'm just giving an example, plucked out of the air for the moment, is, for example, where the UK government allocates funding, as you say, for a policy area that is devolved within Wales. It could be health, it could be education, and as a consequence, there is then an additional sum that is provided to the devolved nation, applying what's called the Barnett formula.
Exactly.
And that, for example, would be positive, but ultimately it's for the devolved government to decide how to spend that money once it's allocated. Alternatively, as you say, where there is an underspend within one of those policy areas, within the English budgets, then there will be a clawback situation, a negative formula that's applied to the allocation of funding.
Yes, that's correct, but sometimes those things will balance each other out at the end of the financial year as well. So you really are almost waiting until the end of the year to know what your budget is for the year that you've just been through.
And that's because those supplementary estimates that you've referred to come in January or February, towards the end of the financial year.
That's correct. And one of the flexibilities that we've been asking the UK government to consider, and which I think would be helpful for future years, would be for any additional funding which comes through following an autumn statement, so anything that comes through in supplementary estimates, or even reductions that come through in supplementary estimates, that we're able to take those through into the next financial year. So we did see some of that in the pandemic. So at the end of the 2020-21 financial year, we were able to negotiate with the Chief Secretaries of the Treasury to take forward £600 million, which had been announced very late in the financial year. It wouldn't have made good sense for us to try and deploy that. I mean, that's a huge amount of money for us, very late in the financial year. So it was agreed by exception that we could carry it over, and it helped with our response in the next financial year. So what we would prefer would be a situation where you're not having to negotiate those kind of things every time, but just as a part of the mechanism, if things come through very late, then you can manage over financial years.
Just dealing with that for one moment and putting it in context, you said that was an exception. What are the normal limits on carryovers into the following financial year?
So as part of the fiscal framework, we have the Wales Reserve. The Wales Reserve is able to hold overall £350 million. And crucially, the size of the Wales Reserve hasn't grown at all since the time it was established, which means that actually in the next financial year it will be worth 23% less than it was at the time it was set. And you can imagine trying to land your budget £23 billion on a Wales Reserve of £350 million. That's a pretty high wire act in normal circumstances. So again, something that I think would help for the future would be for that Wales Reserve just to be uprated in line with inflation, and then for that uprating in line with inflation to happen every year after that. And that's something that it's not just the Welsh Government calling for, it's something that the IFS has said would be a good idea, the Wales Governance Centre, and actually it's not a political point at all, because recently in the Senedd we had a debate which was...
Perhaps I could just pause you there, Minister, only because you'll appreciate that those very high-level issues are likely to be outside of the scope, ultimately, of this inquiry in terms of the bigger issues, and of course what this inquiry is focusing in is in relation to the pandemic, and of course financial flexibility in relation to the pandemic is one of those aspects, but you're talking about much more significant issues.
Yeah, just to say, the reason that I am talking about it is to try and give some ideas for things that would help a government better respond to a pandemic in future.
Absolutely, and I'm sure that's been taken on board. If I may, though, deal with the upshot in relation to 2020 through to 2021 and the financial position with regard to Wales and and in relation to the pandemic response. If I can just take you, please, to paragraph 51 of your witness statement. And you give an example, going back to what you were saying before, of underspend and effectively money being recouped. And you explain that the total underspend in 2020 to 2021 by UK government departments was 25 billion. And the UK Department for Health and Social Care alone underspent by over 9%, returning 18.6 billion to the Treasury. And overall, UK departments returned almost 6% of their funding to the Treasury that year. In Wales, the figures returned represented only 1% of your available resources. A Barnet share of the funding returned to Treasury by UK departments would have been well in excess of 1 billion, rather than the much lower 155 million, which was returned. So is it correct that by the end of that 2020-21 financial year, and I'm going to bring you into the finances in relation to the pandemic in due course, there was a return of 155 million to HM Treasury?
There was, but that only happened at least a year or perhaps even 2 years after that.
Indeed.
And that was because there were discussions that were undertaken at official level with the UK government, whereby we would be able to switch revenue to capital at the end of the year, which is a normal thing. It happens all the time. But unfortunately, in this year, because of course we do need the Chief Secretary's agreement to do that, it was denied. Had we been able to switch that money from revenue to capital, then actually we would have sent nothing back at all to Treasury. And I think that this also, though, speaks to the importance of the Barnet Guarantee as well, because can you imagine a situation where right at the end of the year, supplementary estimates, we're being asked to send £1 billion back to Treasury? That would have been completely unmanageable. So I think it does show how valuable the Barnet Guarantee was for us as well.
Indeed, and that's what we're going to come on to. Really, it's just to lay the groundwork and the foundations for what we're going to be talking about in due course. Do you want to just pick up, if I may, before going into the detail of that, on one aspect within your statement, and it's at paragraph 53, page 18, where you say that you considered that Wales had been treated unfairly, and that's because there's a general approach by Treasury which treats devolved governments as just another spending department. What do you mean by that?
Again, we seem to be straying from Covid-19, unless you're going to say this does affect the pandemic.
It is.
There seems to be quite a big question about the devolution settlement, and
I can certainly bring it back to the pandemic, because that's why I say it's contextual as opposed to anything else. And just in relation to the pandemic, was that something that you experienced or not?
I think it's definitely the case from a finance perspective, because the UK government, I don't think, recognises that we are responsible to the Senedd, that we have an incredible amount of scrutiny from the Welsh media. We have the Welsh public very interested in the choices that we make. And I think that in treating us like another UK government department, it doesn't necessarily recognise the unique context that we have here in Wales, and the fact that we are a government, we're not just another department.
I'm going to bring you now, if I may, into the pandemic response and financial issues, and firstly then deal with your role in Cabinet and the Star Chamber. You obviously, along with other Welsh ministers, were members of the Welsh Cabinet. Each minister we've heard has their own portfolio areas. Generally speaking, to what extent do you believe your contribution at meetings of Cabinet or in the ministerial calls were guided in the main by financial considerations? How were you putting forward your portfolio, or were you looking at the broader picture?
I think that ministers in Cabinet have two distinct but important roles. So on the one hand, you're custodian of your own portfolio, so I was responsible for all finance matters, but equally then you take part in those Cabinet-wide discussions which require a cabinet view. So 21-day reviews would be a really good example of those discussions which we had cabinet-wide. Of course, the Health Minister would bring a particular perspective. I would bring a financial perspective, but then you also consider it in the round as well, because you have collective responsibility for those decisions which are taken.
And how do you consider that you struck the balance in your contributions then in Cabinet between considering, as I say, your portfolio responsibilities of financial and economic considerations and how MPIs or any other intervention could be delivered in terms of finances available and that of public health concerns and scientific advice?
I think there are good examples where, of course, we had to consider the financial implications of the choices available to us. And I know there's an intention to come on to the fire break and potentially Omicron in the session as well. And I think that those will give examples as to where the financial considerations were particularly acute in those discussions.
Did you undertake any modelling of NPIs in relation to the financial impacts of acting or not acting? Essentially, both sides of the coin. Did you undertake any financial and economic modelling in that respect?
So I didn't do that myself, but
No,
of course we've got...
within your team?
We've got Welsh Treasury and we've got a team of analysts. We've got the chief economist and his team of economists within the Welsh Treasury as well, and they would undertake analysis. What I will say as well is that they were involved very early on, and they worked with the policy leads for various things. So the Economic Resilience Fund, for example, they'd be working very early on with the policy leads to undertake the analysis there, rather than being presented with a proposal which is almost done and then considering the economic impacts of it.
Thank you. I'm going to move now to the Star Chamber. Established by the First Minister on the 23rd of March of 2020, so relatively early in terms of the pandemic, and that was to oversee and coordinate the Welsh Government's overall fiscal response to the crisis. Is that right?
That's correct.
Can you assist with why it was established at that point? It's obviously a new meeting point.
It was clear by that point that the response to the pandemic was going to require significant a significant fiscal response. So it really was to have that forum where we could have those discussions. And one of the first things that we did through the Star Chamber was undertake the reprioritisation exercise.
I'm going to come on to that in just a moment, so I can just pause you there. And in relation to the composition or makeup and purpose of the Star Chamber, essentially it was so that a small group could assess the various financial papers, proposals, budgets, as you say, fiscal considerations, and within that small group, and provide advice to you. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
In terms of decision making within the Star Chamber, did the Star Chamber take those decisions, or did you take decisions?
No, I took the decisions. The membership of the Star Chamber, other than having one other minister there, was officials and also one external person and special advisors. So they wouldn't have had the authority to take those decisions in any case.
Thank you. I'm asking for your opinion for one moment. Do you think the Star Chamber should have taken those decisions collectively, like the Cabinet, in terms of those financial decisions, or were there benefits to final decisions being vested in you alone?
No, I definitely think that those are decisions for the Finance Minister rather than decisions which should be taken by anyone else.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn now to the reprioritisation exercise that you've just mentioned, and indeed, just dealing with that. That exercise was to identify areas of Welsh Government spending, both revenue and capital spending, which could be repurposed, in short, in order to assist with the Covid-19 response. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
And those funds would then be repurposed and held in what was called the Covid-19 Response Reserve.
Yes.
Was that exercise, that reprioritisation exercise, completed once or at various points throughout the pandemic?
In the end, it was only needed the once, so we undertook that at the start of the pandemic, and it resulted in around £250 million going into the Covid-19 response reserve. I did warn colleagues at the time that it might be something that we would need to revisit and have another round of reprioritisation, but in the event, because of the consequential funding which was coming through, and also the Barnett Guarantee, which came later. We didn't need to undertake any further reprioritisation, but colleagues would reprioritise within their own budgets as well.
Thank you. And did the response reserve also include the money from the UK government that came in?
Yes, it did, as well as realignment of WEFO budgets as well.
Of what, sorry?
WEFO, European funding budget.
Thank you. European funding budgets. With regard to the reprioritisation exercise, what considerations did the Star Chamber have in mind when considering that exercise?
So we set some principles by which colleagues should, and when I say colleagues, I mean my ministerial colleagues, should undertake reprioritisation within their portfolios. The first of those, that we should obviously continue to do those life and limb things which needed to be undertaken. And then also we couldn't really touch our statutory commitments. And then also we needed to protect as far as possible our key programme for government commitments. But beyond that, I asked colleagues to look through their budgets to see what could be repurposed. And I've given in my written evidence a range of examples there.
Indeed. And the Star Chamber then in turn reviewed the ministerial advice that was coming in from each department in relation to the reprioritisation. Is that right?
That's correct. And I think I had a meeting with each minister as well to talk through their proposals, what the implications would be, and to push a little bit further to see if there was anything else they could give up at that point as well.
And if just dealing with pandemic responses and interventions, if a minister wished to fund such a pandemic intervention from within their existing budgetary allocations, so for example, that reprioritisation within their existing budget, not to put to the reserve, but to deal with an intervention themselves, so it's cost neutral or had a cost, did they have to seek your approval, or were they ministerial decisions within departmental governmental decision making?
No, so I allowed colleagues to reprioritise within their own budgets, and again I've got some examples in the paper. The Education Minister, for example, was able to reprioritise some funding from within her budget at the time towards providing children with IT kit in schools. So I just needed to be informed of those choices which were being made. I didn't have to approve them.
And were there any financial limitations in relation to the extent to which individual ministers could repurpose their own budgets?
No, beyond what they'd already given up. There was nothing that they couldn't do there.
And with regard to the Star Chamber, how frequently did the Star Chamber meet?
So at one point we were meeting every day, and then I think it was a couple of times a week at least then through the pandemic for quite some time, until October of 2020 when we met for the last time. And the reason for that really was that the systems were well set up. We had already funded then some of the big programmes that we needed to fund. So it was just a case of making sure that those programmes had enough money to keep going. It didn't need that kind of level of scrutiny and interrogation that late on, because it was all functioning.
And you are aware that there were some criticisms or concerns in relation to how the Star Chamber was operating, whether it was transparent, for example, how decisions were being made, how individual requests for funding were being dealt with. Did you take any steps to address those concerns?
Yeah, so I knew that some colleagues felt a bit uneasy about the Star Chamber process, and I think that's understandable because it was such a diversion from the way in which we would normally go about setting the budgets, which, you know, we have a normal budget setting process. When my colleagues have their budgets, then they manage them through the year. This was a completely different approach, so I understood the concern there. In the terms of reference for the Star Chamber, it said that other ministers could attend the Star Chamber by invitation. We changed that pretty quickly so that other ministers could attend the Star Chamber at their requests, and many of them did, and it was to talk through some of those proposals, because also it meant that we were able to ask those questions in real time. It wasn't a case then of potentially holding up things. We definitely didn't want to do that. So we did change that approach over time to try and make colleagues feel more comfortable with what was a very new approach to allocating funding.
Thank you. And you also developed during the course of the pandemic a financial dashboard. Is that right too? Setting out in short, resources that the Welsh Government had available to respond to the pandemic, and the aggregate and detailed allocations that had been made to date, so that other ministers and individuals could easily access and see where finances were being allocated.
That's correct, and I shared it with Cabinet on a weekly basis, so everybody had the latest picture.
And did that dashboard contain, in your view, all of the relevant information in terms of fiscal information and economic, financial information that was required by ministers to assist in their decision making, or do you consider that further information would have been helpful?
So I think that the purpose of the dashboard really was transparency for colleagues. I think it was mainly there to help me in my decision making, but also wanting to be clear with colleagues as to where we were overall, and to explain to colleagues, I suppose, if there were times when I wasn't able to provide them with additional funding. So I think that it did provide, a really clear example of where the funding was going, and it shows the sources of the funding. But then we had 4 pillars where the funding went to: supporting the economy, health and public services, the voluntary sector and communities, and transport. And those are our 4 pillars of the response to the pandemic, if you like.
And essentially a visual aid.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you. Now if I can turn, please, to March of 2020 and just deal briefly with your interactions with the then Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, in relation to funding and planning with regard to the potential impact of the pandemic. You wrote a letter on the 6th of March. We can see that on the screen there. Is that the first time that funding for the pandemic was raised between the Welsh Government and the UK Government?
Probably. I couldn't say for sure there. I can't tell if there was a finance quadrilateral before that date. If there was, it would have been raised there. But in writing, I think that's the first time that it's raised.
Okay. That was followed up by a written statement on the 11th of March, which explained that you were working closely with the UK Government and other devolved administrations to prepare for the Covid-19 response. But you say in relation to those measures that would be enacted in terms of the NHS and other measures for business and support and individual support, that further clarity was needed. Can you recall now what was the issue in relation to a lack of clarity?
Yes, so the letter that I wrote to the Chancellor on the 6th of March was ahead of the spring budget. So that's almost a set-piece letter that I write ahead of every fiscal event, setting out the priorities for Wales. And in that, I do recognise that there would be an impact beyond health and social care of the pandemic. And I do say that it would require significant fiscal remedial package from the UK based on need. And then the 11th of March, and the significance of this written statement is that that was the day of the UK Government's spring statement. Now, although the Chancellor announced some measures in that in relation to support for business, and also was clear that the NHS would get all of the support it needed, actually there was no funding which came through in the spring statement. That funding would come later through the form of the Barnett Guarantee. So it was that kind of clarity that we were after, really.
Thank you.
But I should say that we did make it clear that we were welcoming those early remarks about the health service and also about support for business as well.
Indeed, and there was subsequent correspondence between you and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury in relation to, I don't need to necessarily have that brought up, but that's very helpful, setting out essentially what you believe the various allocations of funding according to the Barnett formula would be. When did you first receive confirmation about the extra funding that would be available and received by you, the Welsh Government?
So we received small amounts of information over a period of time. So this was one of the real challenges that we had at the start of the pandemic, was understanding what the size of a consequential funding was, and and what it applied to, if you like. So you can see actually in the letter that you referred to on the 13th that I wrote to the Chief Secretary, to the Treasury, I'm actually in that letter sharing my planning assumptions, because we didn't have any concrete information from Treasury, so I had to set out what we assumed would be coming to Wales, having applied the Barnett formula through our own calculations to make that understanding. And I'm saying to the Chancellor there, essentially, this is what we're factoring into our assumptions. You need to tell us if we're wrong here. So there's all that as well. But I think importantly, in that letter, I do set out that Treasury is in a unique position to enable or prevent the devolved governments from taking timely decisions to respond to the crisis. So we're even setting that out in March, and of course that will become important later on through the fire break and Omicron and so on.
Can you recall when clarity was provided?
So ultimately, clarity came in the autumn statement of that year when we had the transparency tables through. So all the way through March, April, May, June, July, we were having small amounts of information coming through. And that would happen quite regularly, but it was often the case. And I've seen notes from officials about their meetings with the devolved team in Treasury, that sometimes even the devolved team in Treasury wasn't aware of announcements which were coming through. So getting the right information was really tough. When we got to the Barnett Guarantee, that helped a lot. But even after that, we were pressing for a reconciliation, which is essentially where they set out the different sums that have been, or the different interventions that have been provided for through the guarantee, so that we can look at it and see what's included and what isn't. Because sometimes there were big ticket items, for example, additional funding for transport for London. Now that would lead to significant consequentials for us, but we didn't know if it was included. So that made it difficult for us.
Thank you. And just dealing then, as I say, going back to the March position, so before the Barnett Guarantee and so on, the Economic Resilience Fund was announced by the First Minister on the 30th of March of 2020, so it's still relatively early in the pandemic. That was, in short, the Welsh Government's business support scheme. Is that right?
Yes.
In relation to that, what was the purpose of the ERF, the Economic Resilience Fund?
So the Minister for Economy was in charge of the Economic Resilience Fund. My role was about releasing the funding and ensuring that the interventions were affordable to the Welsh Government. So, using things like the dashboard and the Star Chamber and so on. But the purpose of the fund really was to support businesses in a number of ways. One, if a business was in lockdown, for example, we'd support their operational costs. It's really important to recognise that the Welsh Government is not responsible for wage costs. So UK Government is in charge of wage costs, so furlough, for example.
So those were UK governmental schemes that applied across the whole of the United Kingdom?
Yeah, and we wouldn't have the systems or the fiscal power to do that. What we could do was support operating costs. And we always looked to see if there were ways in which we could potentially fill the gaps in some support as well. So I think I recall, and the Economy Minister would be better off to answer these questions, but support, for example, around startups and so on. So we tried to fill the gaps wherever we could.
Essentially an additional funding resource to that which was being provided across the United Kingdom by the UK Government in its overarching response.
That's right, yes.
Thank you. One of the themes that does arise within the minutes for the Star Chambers is the potential for duplication between the different forms of financial support, including the ERF. Was that something that concerned you, effectively, that you had a number of funds that could all be utilised by the same individual, so you had that duplication?
I think that really showed part of the value of the Star Chamber, in the sense that we would have that overview across all of the interventions which were taking place. And we were very clear. For example, you'll see in the minutes of some of the Star Chamber meetings, we would have proposals for financial support for a particular sector, but we would ask first, well, hang on, are the staff able to be furloughed? And, asking those kind of questions to avoid duplication, we were very careful to do that. And I think that was one of the benefits of the Star Chamber.
Thank you. Now I want to move, if I may, to the May-June period of 2020, so moving through the pandemic. And in the Cabinet meetings that took place on the 4th of May of 2020, uncertainty was noted with regard to the prospect of further consequentials owing to a Treasury-based reprioritisation exercise across Whitehall. And a risk, therefore, was identified to the Welsh Government that it could overcommit to the response and recovery measures early in the financial year, with limited opportunity to free up resources from elsewhere later. Firstly, at that point, you've already explained, all the way through until the Barnett Guarantee, you consider the position to be uncertain generally. Is there any way that could have been mitigated in May and June of 2020?
I think much clearer indications from the UK government in terms of the interventions that it was making, what the funding would be, where the funding was coming from. So you'll see in those minutes that I describe my concern about the fact that the UK government's reprioritisation exercise to which you refer might have included health and local government. Now, those are two really big spending blocks for the UK government, extra important for us here in Wales comparatively. So if the UK government was to be reducing funding through parts of health or parts of local government, then it would have a knock-on impact for us in the way that you described at the start about those negative consequential. So that was our real concern there.
And in terms of the impact that all of those different factors had on decisions the Welsh Government was taking at this stage of the pandemic, did that actually have any impact on decision making in relation to MPIs or any of the bigger decisions that were taken?
So I don't think it impacted on the big decisions that we were taking at this point, but we were carrying an awful lot of risk in terms of the allocations that we'd already made and the commitments that we'd already made. So it was a very, very uncomfortable place to be when you don't have the certainty that the funding is going to be there, but we were making those decisions in any case.
And at that point, when coming towards the end of the summer, was a second wave being foreseen, or was that something that was still some time away from being predicted, from your recollection?
So are we talking July or
June of
July?
2020.
Let me see. Well, on the 4th of June, I did, alongside Ken Skates, write to the Chancellor, and at that point I was asking about the intention to revive the coronavirus job retention scheme, so furlough or the self-employed support scheme as well, in the event of a second peak or of the need for local lockdown. So obviously we were thinking about that as early as June the 4th.
There were a number of communications between you and the UK government and your colleagues actually across the devolved administrations in relation to funding through the pandemic. And indeed, just picking up on the letters that you were writing, on the 3rd of July of 2020, you sent a letter to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and that's 66172. And you talk about the general current economic conditions. Of course, this is after coming out of lockdown, essentially moving through. And it talks about, as I say, the UK economy and the retraction there, the recession. It then continues to speak on and then deals with employment support schemes and the coronavirus job retention scheme and the self-employed income support scheme. And those are topics that we will revisit, but if I can just deal with one aspect there, you ask them for clarification as to whether there is an intention to revive the JRS and SEISS schemes if there is a second peak or local lockdowns. Did you receive, firstly, the JRS and the SEISS? Those were UK Treasury-wide schemes, is that right?
That's correct.
They're the furlough schemes and those that are related to self-employment support also. To what extent was the Welsh Government, if at all, involved in decision-making regarding those schemes?
So the first thing to say is we didn't receive a response to the letter to which I refer, which is on the screen at the moment, which was sent on the 4th of June. We weren't involved in the setting up of the furlough schemes or the self-employed support schemes. Those are very much UK government functions in the sense that those wage support schemes and those benefits and welfare, it is a reserved function. So we wouldn't expect to be deeply involved in the detail of that, but nonetheless you would expect to have at least some kind of discussion about what might be what might be helpful for the response in Wales. But those kind of discussions really were about UK government telling us through the finance quadrilateral meetings what their intentions were, rather than exploring with us the shape of those schemes.
Thank you. And just dealing with those schemes, what sorts of decisions, in terms of the decisions that the Welsh Government would be taking, would those schemes have an impact on?
So those schemes, and we've been really clear that we absolutely welcomed them, they were the right thing for the UK government to do. Those schemes allowed us, when they were available, to take decisions, for example, about lockdown. The challenges came when those schemes weren't available. Then the impacts of locking down and preventing businesses from operating would have been awful, in the sense of, large-scale business closures. You'd have, large-scale unemployment. You'd have businesses closing and just not being able to re-employ their staff again. So furlough was absolutely critical in terms of allowing businesses, we called it hibernating, to hibernate and then come back.
So essentially you saw them as closely connected to lockdown
Yes.
decisions. Thank you. There were a number then of further conversations with your counterparts in other devolved administrations, government departments, and indeed the Treasury. And eventually there came a stage where there was a Barnett guarantee that was agreed upon. Firstly, what was the Barnett guarantee?
So the Barnett guarantee reflected the consequential funding which would come to Wales as a result of decisions taken by the UK government in areas which were devolved to Wales. But as you've described, the difficulty was there in terms of getting a proper understanding as to what funding exactly would be coming to Wales, and we needed that to be able to plan. I should say the scale of the additional funding which came to Wales in that financial year, 2020-21, was huge. It was £5.2 billion, a quarter of our normal budget. So we did need that kind of certainty. What the Barnett guarantee did was say that for the rest of the financial year, your Barnett consequentials will not fall below this particular point. So when that arrived, it was very useful. It should have happened earlier, and we should have had that kind of reconciliation earlier than we did then, which came at the autumn statement. So it was definitely a huge step forward, really helpful, but even more clarity was needed than we were given.
And what additional clarity or flexibility would you, well, firstly, did you ask for? And secondly, did you receive?
So in terms of clarity, we were asking all the way through the year, both at ministerial level and at official level, for that reconciliation, because that really does tell you where you are in terms of the consequential funding. So that didn't come till the autumn, which was unfortunate. We're there to be another pandemic. If we could have those reconciliations every couple of months, that would help a lot in terms of that clarity and transparency. In terms of the fiscal flexibilities, what we asked about was that carrying over at the end of the financial year, which I talked about previously. We asked to increase our borrowing limit, bearing in mind, of course, we can only borrow for capital investment, which is essentially infrastructure rather than day-to-day spend. We also asked for full access to the Wales Reserve. So I've described how that's worth £350 million. That would have helped a bit, especially at the start of the pandemic. But in any financial year, you're only able to draw down £125 million revenue and 50 million capital. So those seem pretty arbitrary in terms of drawdown limits. And the Chief Secretary to the Treasury can agree for you to draw down the entire amount from the Wales Reserve. They didn't agree during the pandemic, but they did agree in this financial year because of the cost of living crisis. So there doesn't seem to be any real rhyme or reason. So I think that there are things that we should do in future relating to the fiscal framework, which just make things clearer and don't rely on how well disposed to devolution the CST of the day is, for example, how helpful the CST of the day is. We have the systems there and the systems work regardless of personalities.
Thank you. Moving on then from the Barnett guarantee and just onto one specific topic of policy, Eat Out to Help Out. In relation to that, was there any involvement by the Welsh Government in the Eat Out to Help Out decision?
So, not to my knowledge, certainly not from a finance perspective, but then there isn't really a particular finance angle to that. It's more economic, and I'm sure that the UK government would have had its own health advice on that as well. I did see it in the evidence that the Prime Minister has given to the inquiry that Wales didn't ask to opt out, which I thought was a curious thing to say, because there's no mechanism within the devolution settlement for us to opt in or out of UK government programmes and decisions. So that was a curious thing, I think, to say. Devolution would look very different if we were able to opt in and out of choices that the UK government makes, but that's not devolution.
may I just ask, to the best of your knowledge, were any objections raised to the scheme by either you with your finance hat on or by the Welsh Government more generally?
Not to my knowledge. I do know it was, a popular scheme amongst businesses in Wales, so you should recognise that as well. But, this was a UK Government scheme. It's for the UK Government to defend its scheme.
Thank you. Moving now to firebreak, please, and the firebreak that took place in late October of 2020. The decision was taken in principle to institute a firebreak in a meeting that took place on the 15th of October of 2020. There were a number of proposals that were considered within the meeting, but if I can just please call up the paper that was considered. It's INQ 48876. It's entitled Firebreak Options and Analysis. You can see it hopefully in front of the screen, in front of you. And turning to page 2, if I may. One consideration in relation to the firebreak, and you've alluded to it already, was that relating to the support for businesses and employees in the event that restrictions were reintroduced. What it states here is that the scope to support businesses and employees in the event of national restrictions being reintroduced is largely dependent on financial support from UK Government. Based on availability of funding and scale of impact, it will not be possible for Welsh Government to offer the scale of financial support HMT are able to provide to those businesses and employees impacted by national restrictions. And we see, as it continues down the page, that there are references to a new scheme in relation to the Enhanced Job Support Scheme that was announced by the Chancellor on the 9th of October, dealing with wage costs, so furlough costs, and so on and so forth. That scheme was to commence on the 1st of November, so approximately two to 3 weeks later. One of the issues that was debated at length was the length of the fire break. The minutes of the Cabinet meeting reflect that, and they also record the fact that scientific advice was that a minimum of 2 weeks was required, but 3 weeks was preferable. And then it speaks about balancing, essentially, the need to consider that the longer the restrictions remain in place, the greater the economic, financial and social impact on the well-being of the individuals. But as I say, nonetheless, it was decided in principle that a circuit breaker would be introduced. And that was on the 15th of October. It was after that decision that there was then a series of correspondence between the First Minister and the Chancellor about income support for that fire break. But with regard to the length of that fire break, 2 or 3 weeks, that had already been decided prior to those discussions, hadn't it, within that Cabinet meeting on the 15th of October?
So the purpose of the Cabinet meeting on the 15th of October was to take in principle a decision so that further work could be done, and then we met the next week then to agree the substantive decision. And you're absolutely right, it was the case that the advice was that there should be a minimum of 2 weeks. 3 weeks would be preferable, but if it was 2 weeks, then the advice should be stay home. If it was 3 weeks, it could be stay local. So those were the considerations we were making at the time. But, the longer the fire break, as you said, the greater the economic harm as well. So we were very aware of those things. And it's worth remembering as well, at this point, we had large parts of Wales under those local restrictions as well. So I think that one of the challenges that we didn't know at the time, was that the Kent variant was starting to become more significant. And I think that impacted on the success or otherwise of the fire break, because although it did push back the pandemic by I think it was 3 weeks, I understand, some of that gain wasn't as significant as we'd expected because of the Kent variant being taking hold.
I think Ms Cecil's question was, had the decision in principle been taken on the 15th of October for a 2-week fire break?
So in principle, I think that's the decision that we took, because Swansea University modelling told us in that Cabinet paper on the 15th that 2 weeks would bring R down from 1.4 to 0.8, and the purpose of the fire break would be to both bring R under 1, but then also to consider how we revise the national rules so that we could look into going into winter. But as you've seen, things were more difficult than we'd expected.
And correspondence was then only entered into with the UK government and the Chancellor subsequent to that decision in principle. Do you accept that, Minister?
Yeah, that seems to be the case because, as you say, the letter went from the FM on the 16th.
Indeed. And that letter requested that the scheme, the new scheme, be brought forward to the 23rd of October to start essentially the same date as that fire break. And without getting into the detail of it, there were otherwise 2 parallel schemes potentially running for that period. But dealing with that very briefly, at the point on the 15th of October when the decision for a fire break was taken, the Cabinet were already aware that there was an inability to bring the claims date forward from the commencement of the 1st of November to the 23rd of October, or earlier than that. That's correct, isn't it?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, of course. Sorry, it may have got a little bit muddled. Let me deal with that again. The new schemes that were being announced by the UK government had been announced on the 9th of October, so prior to the Cabinet meeting on the 15th of October, where the decision for the fire break was undertaken. Prior to the announcement of that new scheme on the 9th of October, the devolved administrations had been briefed on that scheme. That's correct, isn't it? And as part of that briefing, the devolved administrations had been told that that job support scheme could not be brought forward owing to difficulties in HMRC's delivery timelines. Is that right?
Yes.
And so that decision on the 15th of October was taken with the full knowledge that that JRS scheme could not be brought forward. That's correct, isn't it?
So the letter that we had in response from the Chancellor said that they couldn't bring the enhanced JSS forward due to limitations in HMRC delivery times, but that letter is undated from the Chancellor, but I'm assuming it was after the 16th?
Perhaps I can assist in relation to the letter. If I can bring that up, it's inquiry 216555, please. The response, this is the response of the 19th of October, if that helps. It's the response to the letter, you can see, of the 16th of October from the First Minister. And if we read down, it says, unfortunately, as the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and I referenced in our briefing with the devolved administrations in advance of the announcement of the scheme, we are unable to bring the claims date for the expansion to the job support scheme forward from the 1st of November to 23rd of October due to limitations in HMRC delivery timelines. And what is being referenced there is the briefing that took place prior to the scheme being announced, and the scheme was announced on the 9th of October. We've established that the devolved administrations you've agreed that were given advance notification and briefed on that scheme. So the point that I'm putting to you is that when you took the decision on the 15th of October, you were already aware that those timelines could not be brought forward. And it was only after that again you then entered into subsequent correspondence.
Well, I think there are questions to be asked of HMRC as to whether those timelines could be brought forward had they needed to be brought forward for England. I think HMRC could certainly have potentially pulled out the stops to do that. We don't know. That's not a question that I can answer. But I think that there's absolutely no harm at all in doing what we should do, which was to press. And the reason why we were asking for that scheme to be brought forward, because it was more generous. So it would have been better for employees and also employers who wouldn't have had to pay the contribution that they had to pay under the coronavirus job retention scheme, which is again why I found it curious that the Prime Minister has said in his written evidence to the inquiry that that the Welsh Government didn't ask for the CJRS to be extended. Well, why would we? Because that was less generous. What we wanted was a better deal for businesses in Wales. And in the end, we did have to undertake the action that we did, despite the fact that it was unreasonable to ask employers to apply for 2 schemes for the same employee. But these were some of the difficulties, and it is what the FM talks about in terms of Treasury operating for England, because when the UK government decided then it would take action, then of course the CJRS was changed and there was a better package available.
And I've got just one final question in relation to that, please, and that is simply, was it reasonable to expect the UK government to be able to change the operation of that schemes in 1 week? The decision made in principle on the 15th, with it to be brought into force effectively, the firebreak on the 23rd.
Yes, I think that is absolutely reasonable, or at least to ask the UK government to set out in a bit more detail what the operational problems are. And one of the things I think is really interesting is that in the UK government's evidence, they often talk about the level of consequential funding that we'd had at this point, as if that would help us, provide a scheme of our own. So if HMRC can't change the operational data within a week, how on earth is the Welsh Government going to have powers devolved to us, set up an entirely new operation and department to be able to do this kind of thing for ourselves? We need the UK Government to be working with us in order to protect businesses.
Thank you, Minister.
So this is all about the amount of money in the scheme. So the job retention scheme was going to go on till the 31st of October. So had you had a fire break of 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever, there would have been a job retention scheme in place.
There would, yes.
And it was all about how much money those in receipt of payments got either under the job retention scheme or under the new scheme, which is more generous.
Yes, the new scheme would have been more generous, but also the coronavirus job retention scheme required employer contributions, whereas the scheme which we were asking to be brought forward wouldn't. So again, that would have been better.
But it's not that the UK government wasn't providing financial support. It was simply that you wanted the new amount of money that would come under the new scheme.
That's correct. And we also didn't want businesses to have to apply twice for the same person, but also some of the worst affected sectors had staff who, because of who weren't eligible for the coronavirus job retention scheme, because that required staff to have been furloughed before 30th of June. And of course, we're talking about tourism, retail, hospitality businesses here, which were, recruiting after that date. So there were potentially employees who wouldn't have been eligible for support under that CJRS.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Chair, but there are some questions on behalf
There
of
are
the participants.
seven, I think. And I think you've got a question that on my list originally was in the wrong for the wrong witness. So I think have you got 3 questions or 2?
Only 2 now. I've reduced them down.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's Mrs Evans. I represent Covid-19, Bereaved Families Justice Cymru. First topic, please, is WhatsApps. So I'm just going to read you paragraph 40 of this is your first witness statement, because you obviously did 2 witness statements. So your first witness statement said, I would use WhatsApp or text in my Trefennydd role during plenary to let ministers who were not in chamber know when they had 5 minutes before the start of their statement debate. So they should return to the chamber urgently. I'd also use WhatsApp text messages to send messages of a more personal nature, such as supportive messages to let colleagues know that they had done a good job in a press conference, for example. You then, and that statement, of course, was signed true to the best of your knowledge and belief. You then provided the inquiry with a second statement. First statement was the 1st of November 23. Second statement was the 15th of December 23, where you change your evidence to the inquiry in relation to WhatsApps. And here at paragraph 10, I'll read it again to you, say that you used WhatsApps on a personal phone, and these comprise messages to my cabinet colleagues, sometimes from my perspective as a constituency member of the Senedd, or to special advisors seeking confirmation on factual information, exchanging information and views, giving updates, making practical arrangements, and providing each other with support, but that you did not make decisions via informal messaging platforms. Now, we've obviously, I don't know if you were in the inquiry when Eluned Morgan gave evidence, but we did just look at some WhatsApps between yourself and Eluned Morgan where you're very clearly asking for clarity on the rules and the guidance. I think we had one on static caravans, we had one on swimming lessons. I just want to ask you about 1 or 2 more, please. So if we could have INQ 30303219, and the first one is at page 15. So that will just pop up on your screen there. Is it up on your screen? It's the top of the page. It's another query from yourself. 1 more question. A socially distanced outdoor concert for 30 people, allowed or not allowed? I think not allowed, but don't want to be wrong on this, as it's for charity. As you can see, I'm clearing some casework. And then if we just turn to page 24, please, for the final one, and it's at the very bottom. Thank you. Here we have yourself, and it's the 5th of October 2020, for FM and VG mostly, but following up from Cabinet. Mick is very opposed to debating 16 and 17 tomorrow because it bypasses his committee and their opportunity to scrutinise. I do share his concerns about bypassing scrutiny, and then you go on. And then Mr Gething says this: I think we should say it's up to the legislature. It's a balance between having an earlier vote. And then he goes on, and then you say, in response, I agree, it's for the legislature. So pausing there, would you agree with me that the first statement you gave to the inquiry about your use of text messages was wrong and misleading, wasn't it?
No, I don't agree with that at all. I would say that I expanded on the evidence that I gave, and I would also like it put on record that I have provided the inquiry with extensive WhatsApp and text messages. What you're seeing here has absolutely nothing to do with the COVID inquiry. This, if I may, this relates to the legislature, and I think it relates to votes at 16 and 17, so that has nothing to do with
You're making government decisions.
COVID-19.
You're making decisions here with Vaughan Gething, aren't you, on WhatsApp? That's what that shows. I know it's not in relation to COVID.
That is a discussion, and I say it's for the legislature. It's clearly not a matter for the executive, as in us as Welsh Government ministers.
But my question that I was, just so you understand what I was putting to you, I appreciate you've changed your evidence, you've provided a second statement, but what I was suggesting to you is that your first statement was not correct because you were simply saying that you were only using WhatsApp to send messages to remind people that they had 5 minutes or of a personal nature. That's what you said in your first statement. So I'm just simply asking you whether you agree that that first statement was incorrect in terms of what you were in fact using WhatsApp for, and I've taken you to some of them. For example, you were clearly asking for clarity on regulations, but that doesn't appear in your first statement, does it?
I expanded in my second statement, and I think what you see really is a conscientious member of the Senedd. So just to be clear, we have two completely separate jobs. We're members of the Senedd and we're also members of the Welsh Government. We have different offices, we have different staff, different email addresses, different diaries, the whole thing are separate. So I spent hours every day on top of my government work, working as a member of the Senedd, responding to queries from constituents. And what you see a lot of the time is what happens when you've got legislation and guidance which is being made at pace, making contact with reality and real people's lives. And so we had all kinds of queries. So the example which was given previously, which related to swimming lessons, the last sentence wasn't read out. And the next question was, so the constituent is telling me that swimming is on the curriculum, this should be treated as an education matter rather than a recreation matter. So those kind of questions I think are legitimate for a conscientious member of the Senedd to be following up.
Well, I think you've given your evidence. Can I just move on finally to one more topic, please? And it's your views on face coverings. And if I, as you're aware, Frank Atherton had certain views in relation to face coverings, and it would seem from the WhatsApps that you took a slightly different view. So if I can ask you about one, please. And it's INQ 30316403, and it's page 45, please. And it's just at the top, a few lines down, and Lee Waters introduces some polling on masks. There we are. And you say as follows: interesting for me, one benefit of masks is that they are a visual reminder that coronavirus is still out there, even though we can't see it. And if I can just ask you about one more entry, please, which is at page 46. And this is part way down. It says Rebecca Evans, deaf CP end. In the middle, deaf CP end, we're dropping out at the same time. Really wanted to ask Frank about the latest evidence on masks, getting a lot of correspondence on this. And then if you see a little bit further down, Leslie Griffiths has said, can you see, Rebecca, have passed your question to Frank, so hopefully you will hear the answer. So first of all, what correspondence were you getting, and why were members of the public concerned? And also, were you trying to, on this occasion or indeed others, put your views forward to Frank about the importance of face coverings?
So again, this is me operating in my member of the Senedd role, which is separate in the sense that I'm saying I'm getting a lot of correspondence on it. I would have to go back and check through my records what correspondence I was receiving. But my own view is that, as I've said here, is that masks I thought were a really good visual reminder to people. Masks said to people as well that I care about you because, as you remember, masks you wear to protect others rather than yourself. And I thought it was a good visual sign, really, that we could be looking after each other in the community. So I always was on the more cautious end of things when masks were concerned.
Okay, thank you very much, my lady. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Heaven. Mr Jacobs.
Ms Evans, I ask questions on behalf of the Trade Union Congress, the TUC and the Wales TUC. An issue on which my clients called for action during the pandemic was for financial support for those needing to self-isolate. The concern was that those on lower incomes and in insecure work in particular would struggle to self-isolate.
Is your microphone on, Mr Jacobs? Sorry.
Should I start the question again?
Okay.
Maybe.
Well, I think, yes, you better for the transcript.
Yes. Ms Evans, an issue on which the TUC and the Wales TUC called for action during the pandemic was for financial support for those needing to self-isolate. The concern was that those on lower incomes and in insecure work in particular would struggle to self-isolate if for 2 weeks of self-isolation they had no or little income, would struggle to pay for food and rent and so on. Was that a concern shared by the Welsh Government?
Yes, it was.
The concern in particular was that it particularly impacted lower income, higher risk sectors in which health outcomes were already poorer, those working in food processing plants, cleaners, porters, those in transport, social care and so on. Was that aspect of the concern one shared by the Welsh Government?
Yes.
Ms Evans, the Welsh Government introduced the self-isolation support payment scheme, didn't it?
It did, yes.
And that was towards the end of October 2020, is that right?
Yes, correct.
That was 8 months after self-isolation was first introduced as a key NPI in response to the pandemic. Was that far too late?
I certainly would have wanted to have been able to do that that sooner, and I've been thinking very much about this, and I think that one of the challenges we had at the time was that by the time we got to July, we were facing, and you see it in some of the documents I've shared with the inquiry, that we were facing up to £1 billion to £1.5 billion of forecast pressures on the Welsh Government's budget. That didn't even include what we might need if there was a second lockdown, or if you include extra pressures on Welsh Government resources, for example, job losses leading to higher claims on various types of support. So there were huge pressures at the time, and I remember looking recently at some documents where where Welsh Government officials were looking at that £600 million, which was announced by the UK Government for infection control in care homes. And I think that that was one area where we were trying to get clarity as to whether or not that included consequential funding for the self-isolation within those care homes as well. So I think it is a scheme that definitely we would have wished to have brought in earlier. I think that it demonstrates one of the tough decisions we had to make from a financial perspective in terms of being able to agree to an open-ended financial commitment, which could be significant when you don't have the clarity of the budget available to service it.
Ms Evans, clearly significant budgetary pressures, but for those first 8 months, the additional sum spent on financial support for those in work but needing to self-isolate was zero, wasn't it? Whatever the financial pressures, could it not have been more than that?
I think that, were we to look back and be able to do things again, we could have looked at that. We could have looked at that earlier. That's definitely fair to say. From a financial management perspective, that would have increased the risk even further. When I say, £1 billion of pressures and 1.5 or up to £1.5 billion of forecast pressures without even a second lockdown, that is huge. And
Yes.
I think that is really, what we need to be considering as well. So it does demonstrate some of the tough financial choices you have to make in these circumstances.
Would the Barnett Guarantee in July 2020 have been an opportunity to take some action on the issue of financial support for self-isolation?
I'd go back and think about it. It could have been a point at which we could have done that. But even when we got to July and had that Barnett guarantee, we were still well beyond the Barnett guarantee in terms of the funding that was required as well.
Just finally, in the latter part of the pandemic, you will recall, I'm sure, that the Welsh Government increased the £500 self-isolation support payment to £750. Can you help us with the rationale for that? And was there concern in particular that even a £500 payment wasn't sufficient to remove the financial barriers to self-isolation?
So it would have been my colleague, the Minister with responsibility for social services at the time, who would have been responsible for asking us to increase that funding. But at that point, affordability was different. So we had, we had the Barnett guarantee, then we had uplifts to the Barnett guarantee to the point at which we were even carrying money over at the end of the financial year. So affordability is, unfortunately, always one of the things that we have to think about when we're looking at supporting different programmes.
I think I'm at my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Jacobs. Thank you very much indeed, Ms Evans. Very grateful for your help.
Thank you.
And we shall adjourn now and 10 to 2. Thank you.